Tonight's topic is the philosophy of mind. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, please subscribe, join the comment section, and press the like button. And if you really like it, you should mention that on YouTube channel and on the API website, there is a voluntary donate button. Any contribution, no matter how large or small, will be gratefully received. Welcome, Howard.
Welcome to the Philosophy of Mind. I realized over the last maybe 6-8 weeks that it's a huge topic. I had some kind of rudimentary understanding going into it, but I had some time to devote to reading, so I kind of dug in. At times it was hard to know when to stop. There's a lot of sort of rabbit holes, and one question leads to another, as things do philosophically. I ended up sort of settling on 4 main texts, and then supplementing a lot of that with essays and other readings. A huge limitation, I guess, is that everything's pretty much from a Western perspective, and I know there's other philosophical traditions have a lot that's really interesting to say about consciousness and mind. My brother-in-law is into Vedantic meditation, and he's tried to sort of guide me through some of that, and we end up having involved discussions with that. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm pretty much focused on the Western philosophical tradition. So 3 books. Patricia Churchland in 1989 wrote a book called Neurophilosophy Toward a Unified Science of Mind-Brain, and she introduced the term neurophilosophy to the Lexis. So that's a PDF, and that's online, so that works. So that's accessible. There's no table of contents, and there's no index, but it's a really interesting read. Rex Welshon's Philosophy, Neuroscience, and Consciousness. It's a kind of a very broad encyclopedic survey of most of what's been said on the topic up till 2011. Some really challenging stuff in there, but some interesting stuff as well. V.H. Ramachandran, The Brief Tour of Human Consciousness. He's kind of a clinical therapist, and he's done a lot of work with sort of phantom pain and with amputees and with sort of lesion studies and people who've had sort of cognitive impairments. So there's a real clinical therapeutic aspect to all this. And I started off with John Searle's The Mind, A Brief Introduction. In terms of the format of the presentation, I'll try and go for 35 minutes and then have 20 minutes for commentary or questions, and then do another 35 minutes. So philosophy of mind. Oh, let me go back up. I guess I have 2 tentative subtitles there. Toward a non-reductive neurophilosophy, and I hope that will become clear as I proceed, and maybe chasing homunculi, which will also become clear, I hope. Question marks there. I didn't land where I wanted to land on this. As I said, I got quite involved in a number of rabbit holes, and I ultimately wanted to say more about self and theories of self and maybe free will, but I didn't quite get there. I think I got a little bit lost in the neuroscience, but hopefully it'll still be valuable and interesting. I'll start off with John Searle. He says, consciousness is the very essence of meaningful existence. So why the philosophy of mind? Presumably we're conscious and we're interested in what it means to be alive and a human being. Part 1 overview. There's some big questions. What's called the hard problem of philosophy. I'll talk briefly about neurophilosophy and how that emerged. We'll start off with Descartes. Descartes' substance dualism, and that kind of launches the modern discussion of mind-body philosophy or philosophy of consciousness. Then I'll proceed with a brief introduction to the brain, and I'll have a couple of brain interludes throughout the presentation. And when I was going through the material, the neurophilosophical material, it kind of moved back and forth between philosophical discussions and models and neuroscience, and taking some detailed look at the brain. So I'll emulate that here, and then I'll talk really quickly about brain science and some of the epistemologies and etymologies and the techniques by which they arrive at their hypotheses, some of which are, I guess, have been more confirmed than others. So a couple of big questions. What do we mean by mind? What is consciousness? We'll see it encompasses everything from sensory perceptions to feelings, hopes, intentions, desires, self-reflection, self-recriminations, intentions, will. So consciousness covers a broad field, and different definitions of consciousness have resulted in different philosophies of mind. How are mental conscious states and activity related to brain states and activity? There's a consensus, contemporary consensus for the most part, that mind comes from brain. Now, what's the relationship between those two entities? A major question is the extent to which mental states and consciousness are reducible to brain states. Is that ultimately what consciousness is, and what we are is atoms in collision and little flits of neurons, or complicated configurations and architectures of neuronal activity. And how can neuroscience inform philosophy of the mind and other philosophical questions more broadly? I like the way Ramachandran puts it here. So I'll read from the screen. I think I'll end up doing this a little too much during the presentation, so I'll try and restrain myself. Ramachandran asks, how does the activity of neurons, mere wisps of protoplasm, he says, give rise to all the richness of our conscious experience, the richness of our mental life, our feelings, emotions, thoughts, ambitions, our religious sentiments, our love lives, our own private self? He says all this is simply the activity of these little specks of jelly in our head. There's nothing else. That's a pretty materialist position, fairly standard. Obviously, there are implications of the mind-brain question for other branches of philosophy. Human ontology, what are we as a species? I think in some ways, we recognize, we assume that human beings are at the pinnacle of some sort of, biological order on Earth. And maybe in some ways we see ourselves as detached from nature, or detached from natural or biological processes. But what are we as a species, and what role does consciousness play in that? Who are we as individuals? Self-concept and self in relationship. Big one is agency, free will, ethics, and criminal justice system. If everything's just atoms in collision and there's no free will, they're kind of big implications for application of criminal justice, rehabilitation, punishment, even praise and blame more generally. If everything's just mechanistic, and we're just the offshoot of physical processes, why do we deserve praise or blame? So pretty big implications there. A social political theory as well. Education and pedagogy as part of culture and socialization. My last couple of years of teaching, brain research started to come very explicitly into the professional development sessions, and teachers probably for the last decade started taking a look at some of the brain research and finding out what's going on when kids wrestle with and get or fail to get concepts. And so it's pretty complex. A series of interactions, aesthetic appreciation, and again, clinical and therapeutic applications as well. Oh, yeah. Back on the ethical point, question of animal rights and robots' rights sometimes come up. I reconnected with an old friend who's a vegan. He gave me a really hard time for eating animals, and I guess one of the at some point the conversation veered to levels of consciousness within species. He's since convinced me to give up eating mammals. I haven't yet got to fowl or a fish, but we had considerable conversation about whether the extent to which fish or mollusks, shrimps were conscious, and what sort of ethical obligation I had towards other species. So, very real applications or implications of this. What's going on when we think of something or when something comes to mind? So if I were to say, think about ice cream, and pause for a minute and think about ice cream, what comes to mind and how? Or how about friendship? So I'm curious whether, concepts come as images. When I said ice cream, if you thought of a cone or a cup or a brick or an ice cream shop or people you've had ice cream with, So when we receive sensory stimuli, how does that affect consciousness? And what are the processes by which I would think of an ice cream cone rather than a cup, or an ice cream shop, or having ice cream with a friend? In terms of neurophilosophy, this is from Patricia Churchland. She says it proposes a two-way conversation between science and philosophy, and she envisions a rich interanimation, the coevolution of theories, models, and methods, where each informs, corrects, and inspires the other. And Rex Welshon says, maybe tongue-in-cheek, if scientists have only recently started talking seriously about consciousness, philosophers have rarely stopped talking about it over the last 2,000 years. One of the key terms of neurophilosophy is NCCs, short for the neurocorrelates of consciousness. Presumably, mind stuff comes from brain stuff, and brain stuff comes from neural firings and pathways and architectures, and it's these that give rise to conscious experience. I'm going to play with a laser pointer, see if that works. Yeah, so here's a model. Here's the outside world, sensory apparatus, the brain. And then inside the brain, here's a depiction of neurons. And beside that, this to me almost seems like a DNA coding process. So I guess part of the idea is this guy's vision of the world can be reduced to neuronal activity and maybe to mathematics in some ways. So some of the epistemologies and methodologies, imaging technology has been a real game changer. PET scans, deep brain scan, the body of work, understanding the brain. There's been a lot of impairment and dysfunction and anomaly studies. So if you look up lesion studies or split brain studies, a lot of what we know about the brain is coming from the therapeutic fields and people trying to figure out how to deal with impairments and anomalies. There's clinical psychological experiments, interspecies brain and behavior studies. Pharmacology has added a lot, whether or not one agrees with pharmacological solutions. A lot of money, I guess, and time and energy has gone into pharma research, understanding the brain. Apparently, we still don't know how aspirin works on sort of micromolecular level, but everything from pain relief to antidepressants, antipsychotics, and pharmaceuticals for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And of course, formal logic is always there, analytic philosophy, thought experiment as an epistemology. It's various scans. Interspecies brain comparison. I guess we can see green, red, and blue areas devoted to sensory motor functions, visual functions, and auditory area. For me, the big takeaway here is how much additional real estate in the human brain is free and devoted to other aspects of cognition and consciousness compared to, say, a rat or a cat. Clinical psychological experiment, a standby for understanding cognition and how the brain works. This particular experiment was kind of interesting. A split brain patient as a treatment, a radical treatment for epilepsy. I guess practitioners severed the two hemispheres, and it did alleviate the worst of the epilepsy, but there were some other anomalies, obviously. In this experiment, the experimenter flashed words on a screen, let's say spoon, and asked the subject to identify, to tell the researcher what he saw, and the subject said, "I don't see anything." There was no sort of connection to the linguistic side. But when the researcher flashed the word spoon and asked the subject to reach on the other side of a screen and take hold of the implement that he thought the word on the screen applied to, he was able to pick up a spoon. So consciousness operates on multiple different levels and through different modalities. And in this instance, the language modality was deactivated, but the subject was still able to make meaning of the word flashed on the screen. In terms of philosophies of mind and consciousness, I'm going to put on that little laser. It's quite huge, and this is a sort of grossly reduced and simplified chart of the field. Different philosophies of mind play out along sort of the axis of dualism and monism. the biggest contention, more largely contended area is here between reductive physicalism, which says absolutely everything that goes on in consciousness can be reduced to neural architecture, neural activity, and non-reductive physicalists and property dualists who say, yes, consciousness and cognition comes from the brain, but somehow it yields something extra above and beyond the mere neural firings. So again, here's probably the main contentious area between those two. I wasn't sure where to put Eccles or David Chalmers. There's some AI and quantum mechanics implications in reductive physicalism as well. René Descartes, the philosophy of the mind in the modern era effectively begins with René Descartes, says John Searle. And Descartes says the universe is made up of two substances: physical substance, the stuff of physics. It has stuff that has mass, physical dimension, and is extended in space. And the physical stuff is atoms in collision and operates mechanistically according to the laws of physics. And then for Descartes, there's mental substance, there's soul, which is immaterial, it's immortal, it's not extended in space, and it's the basis of rational consciousness, self, and free will. A couple of problems posed by Cartesian psychophysical dualism: the problem of interaction and the problem of self or homunculus. So if the mind and body are two completely different substances, how the heck do they interact? By Descartes' own admission, says Welshon, there has to be some organ in the brain that mediates the non-spatial realm of consciousness, immaterial mind, and the physical spatial realm of the body. And Descartes proposed the pineal gland as some sort of intermediary point. But that doesn't really solve the problem. It just relocates it or localizes it. There's still the problem of the interaction between the immaterial and the material. And neuroscience is still puzzling over that. The second problem, I guess, is what's been derisively called the ghost in the machine by Gilbert Riley, or the homunculus, the little man, or the Cartesian theater. So, and these critics suggest that Descartes proposes a little man, or a sort of Captain Kirk, or somehow in the command seat of consciousness, and the homunculus, this little man, is immaterial. The ghost in the machine, everything in the physical world operates by the laws of physics, but somehow the ghost in the machine, or the homunculus, is immune from all that. And the little homunculus attends to the internal movie theater of experience, processes sensations and perceptions, makes sense of things, exercises free will. But the problem is a problem of infinite regress. What's the basis of consciousness for the homunculus? Is there a smaller homunculus in that one? And the iteration of ever smaller homunculi never stops. If the infinite regress is to be avoided, Welshon says the first stop is to find the neural mechanisms. And Churchland says, as things stand, the notion of a center of consciousness or center of control, let alone a mind, a person, or soul, she says those are very theoretically fuzzy. And as a reductive materialist, I guess she'd like to eliminate those until there's more evidence for them. A quick brain overview and interlude. I guess this model had been kicking around for a while. Paul MacLean's triune brain model, presumably the reptilian brain that are responsible for and the seat of instinctive functions, and then the limbic brain, center of emotions, and that presumably kicks in with mammals who breastfeed, and then the neocortex, the human brain. That model's been widely considered outdated and inaccurate. One, because there's far more interaction among the components of the brain than the model allows, and there are also evolutionary biological examples that aren't accounted for them. Birds have a lot of brain centers concerned for their young, or attentive to the young, which doesn't fit with this model. Primates make tools, et cetera, et cetera. So there is still some segmentation, higher mental functions associated with the orange area, the frontal cortex, centers devoted to eye movement, speech, sensory apparatus, language comprehension, and so on. The real crux of the cookie, I guess, presumably, is the cerebral cortex. It's this 2 to 4 millimeter thick outer layer of gray matter, just above the white matter. Reportedly contains 14 to 16 billion neurons spread over 4 lobes. And again, the frontal orange lobe at the bottom here, responsible for more of the executive thought, presumably, but there's lots of interaction. So 86 billion neurons, estimated number of connections, over 1 trillion connections among the neurons. And I guess the physicalists say that's what consciousness and meaning and we come down to as conscious beings. And by way of comparison, the total neuronal count for a leech, 8,500 as opposed to 86 billion. So if the leech had a Cartesian theater, I think the screen would be pretty blank or dark. Descartes says that matter is divisible. It certainly is, and I guess we have fairly comprehensive understanding of how neurons work. It's both electrochemical, it's both electrical and chemical. There's 2 different processes for that, and presumably consciousness takes place in this area here, the synaptic cleft, or one aspect of consciousness. Is the synapse going to connect, is the neuron going to connect with another? And that's, I guess, determined by a level of the degree to which the neuron is stimulated. And so maybe this stuff happens here. Does it fire or not fire? In what patterns? And if one piece fires, that could set off, hundreds of thousands of other firings. That synaptic cleft. But it's not just excitation, there's also inhibitory neurons as well. I guess our brain would get overwhelmed if there weren't some sort of regulatory system. So it's a dance between excitation and inhibition. And I guess some disorders, sort of more clearly linked to, dysfunctions of inhibitory neurons, excitation and inhibition. And there, here on the right, the chemical and the electrical dimensions of that. I came across this project by a neuroscientist and applied physicist. It was quite interesting. And they're artists as well. So they took a lot of neural imaging and then added some kind of aesthetic staining to them. And they had mounted a couple of shows called The Self-Reflective. And it was just neurons and brain activity on these huge 8-foot by 10-foot panels. So there's a link to that. It's pretty interesting. They wanted to have it as anatomically or neurologically accurate as possible, but lots of beautiful images there. Okay, I guess I've lost a bit of time, so I'll probably miss some, have to leave out some stuff, but maybe this might not be a bad spot for a break for either commentary or questions. Minnie?
Oh, yes, I'm here.
How are you doing?
Good. Thank you, Howard, for, I know we're almost in half, but it's very thoughtful and it's making me think. One of the things that caught my attention was when you said essentially the reductionism, meaning it's brain, and whether it's brain, but whatever is happening in the brain is there's something extra that's happening and that extra is an interesting proposition. And I think that is something that I would like to one day follow up. I believe it is what's happening in the brain, and just because we don't understand it, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Thinking there's something extra, the extra would be a property of what's happening, not a property, not something spiritual or or it is something, it's a property of the complexity of the brain. And that is a very interesting proposition.
So, I mean, the property dualists distinguish between, they say there's not two substances, but there's a property, but it gets into this murky area, right? So John Searle says, consciousness is causally reducible to the brain, but not ontologically reducible. So it's some pretty thin slicing and dicing. And Patricia Churchland would say, well, that's just sentimentality. That's why you're hanging on to that something extra, because you don't want to give up the idea that there's something special about us beyond atoms and collision. Bill?
Well, I'll go on record as saying I'm a materialist, and but I'm a strong proponent of emergence. I think emergence is a new area of research that is promising. And it's also, because it's new, it's strange to a lot of people and it's unexplainable. But I consider consciousness in the same, understandable in the same way that stock market movements are understandable or traffic is understandable. We all have a solid understanding that I can be surprised one day because traffic is flowing well, and I can be surprised the next day because traffic is not flowing well. And there's no explanation for it other than it's an emergent characteristic of a whole bunch of people trying to drive, acting independently, but trying to drive somewhere. And I believe consciousness is the same thing, that there's no single gland or single neuron that represents consciousness. It's something that just materializes out of the interactions of the neurons. It's not magic. It's just and there's nothing extra. It's just the extra, if you want, comes from the extreme complexity of individual neurons firing based on stimuli. So anyways, I'll throw that out there as a source of debate if you want.
That's great. No, I've come across emergent theory and sort of dipped into a little bit, but I didn't get all that far. But yeah, the idea, so you're not saying that the sum is greater than the total of the parts? Or it is?
No, well, that's what emergence is. For instance, there's wonderful pictures of, like, termite mounds are incredibly complex. Cities are incredibly complex. There's, termites are literally, as far down the consciousness spectrum as you can probably go, but somehow they magically create these cathedrals. And how do they do that? Each one is just simply following, some very basic programming. There's no termite architect that is master planning these mounds. Everybody's just carrying one thing of sand, and I programmatically put it, more or less programmatically put it where, it seems sensible for it to go, and somehow these things grow huge cathedrals of sand, one grain at a time. And that's a really good example of each individual termite is following a very simple program, but once you take 1 million termites and repeat that pattern, every 5 seconds, you get this wonderful emergence coming out. And I think consciousness is very similar to that, in that, I don't think we'll ever understand it all the way down to when I have a thought, which neurons are firing, because it's the complexity of the neurons and the timing and the different connections.
Breaking up for me.
I think Howard's
I'll just add to the introduction to neural networks in the last 5 years is kind of pointing us in that direction as well, because what we're seeing with neural networks, and you had that image of a person perceiving a dog. Well, a neural network can do that very well. Tell you which photos in your thing have a particular person in it. So it's doing exactly that. It's completely unconscious of what it's doing, of course, but neural networks are not explainable in the traditional sense, because you can look at a neural network and not understand how it's figuring out that this is a dog and this is a cat. There's no kind of algorithm that gets you there. The neural network emerges, or the knowledge in the neural network emerges from basically feeding it a whole bunch of raw data. But there's no sort of program that says, oh, here's what a dog looks like and here's what a cat looks like. It's just emerging out of the data that it's absorbed.
Howard, are you back? Unmute yourself. Yeah, unmute, Howard.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're back now, right?
Yep. Yeah, I lost
you
it.
sort of disappeared for a while. So
Yeah,
Bill,
yeah.
Bill sort of filled in for you, as it were.
Terrific.
Yeah, take it away.
Yeah. I mean, Churchland would say there are mechanisms, we don't know them yet, but neuroscience will come closer to filling in the blanks. Shashir, and then Henry.
Thank you, Howard. Wonderful talk. Really opened up our mind, maybe our consciousness, to so many possibilities. Having said that, I'm a little disappointed that you did not explore the other side of the world, which talks so much about consciousness. And the consciousness they talk about is really saying your body changes, your cells change, your bacteria within you continue to change, and yet you remain. You think that your identity, your consciousness still remains. So can we try to explaining it in a material way or instinctive way, or how termites build their structures? It really takes you to the point of, are we just stimulus and respond? And if that's all we are, then how can you understand our mind? It's like asking a knife to cut itself. It's like asking an eye to look at itself, or a fish trying to describe the ocean. These things are really beyond the stimulus and response type of consciousness. Consciousness gives us a chance to observe, think, and really see far beyond just the stimulus state of mind. So if science itself, which used to be very Newtonian, saying these are the laws which remain firm, if they themselves have now come to a point where they say things really are uncertain, whether it's a particle or it's a wave, we are not sure if that cat is alive or dead in that box. These are really the type of things that make you wonder if there is such a thing as a material science. Because all things are possible in the world of relativity and quantum theory now, where uncertainty is become primary based upon not any particular material thing, but based upon the intention of the observer. Now, where does that take us in terms of trying to define material world in a conscious way? So there are some thoughts that we can all probably mulch over.
Those are great points, and I thank you for them. I mean, I'd love to hear a more detailed presentation on alternative perspectives of consciousness. I mean, science, it does get us has got us far, and I wouldn't suggest that ultimately everything can be to materialist explanations, but yeah, certain limitations. And I've sort of just dipped into quantum theory a little bit, and I have a couple of notes on them that I can share at the end. Henry, but thanks. No, that's great points. That's a real limitation of what I'm doing here. Yeah, Henry.
Yes, I'd like to expand a little bit on Shashir's question. Shashir usually hijacks my question and then ask them in a better way. But the trivial question: can we define mind? Because is mind a function of brain? What is mind? I'm not aware of any clear definition of mind. We operate this terminology, but can we really describe what mind is?
Well, I guess the neuroscientists are trying to find the correlates for different areas of consciousness, and they've managed to do some of it. They recognize in patients who have suffered strokes that language centers are in one place and face recognition is in another place, and sensory apparatus is in a third place. It's still quite rudimentary, but they have identified pretty clearly some correlates of consciousness and of conscious experience, at least as they're observable from the outside. Now, later in the presentation, we'll get to interstates and qualia, which is a separate matter. But it seems to me, at least from a neuroscientific point of view, the attempt is to find connections between neural and our conscious experience. But yeah, Rand? Rand?
Sorry, I just we base our opinion of on the visual presentation. If the person had a stroke, the person lost the ability to speak and present himself herself, we make a conclusion that the mind is impacted. But how do we know? We based again on a visual presentation, but we cannot know for sure what's happening inside the mind.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they're working on it, Rand. And what they'll find, I don't know. But yeah, I'm sort of describing the project, the neurophilosophical project. Rand.
Thanks, Howard. Since you're not a neuroscientist, I figure I should ask you a completely unfair question.
Yep.
I'm curious, is there been any work to try and establish within the brain the difference between free will and determination, which seems to be a fundamental part of philosophy?
I don't know what you mean by termination.
Determinism.
Determination between free will and determination. Being a determinant or free will, right?
Yeah.
As far as the actual neuroscience goes.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a ton written about free will and determinate free will and indeterminate free will, and I haven't really dug into that aspect. So maybe there are other people who can, who can better, inform it. But the most recent piece I saw in terms of free will and selfhood, it didn't present it as an ontological question of whether human beings have free will, but more an individual question. There seemed to be some criteria that resulted in people having more or less impulse control, or more or less ability to direct their attention. So, this, is there free will for humans is as much as what are the variables that allow human A, B, or C to direct his or her attention, or to process and control his or her impulses. So it's not, and he says education has a lot to do with that. Environment has a lot to do with that. How the brain gets configured from an early age. So it's not a broadly ontological question. It's more a question of individual neural platforms. I don't know if that helps. But I did come across a lot about determinism and indeterminism, but I can't speak intelligibly to it. Tori?
Yeah, Howard, that's great. A good review of all the big issues there. And I kind of want to ping on actually what Henry was talking about, brought up, just what is mind. And as some of you know, I've been deeply reading philosophy, and its changes in beliefs and metaphysics in particular over the last couple centuries. And as your talk, Howard, was on the philosophy of mind, there's a co-discourse to that which emerged since Descartes' time, which is also the philosophy of language. And the two trends are very interconnected. And it's resulted, as I've said in my talks here on the API, that the metaphysics of Descartes have been blown away, and it's been even before Descartes, it's been thousands and thousands of years of metaphysical paradox of how could there be in the mind, or how can there be reality both external to the body as well as internally represented in the
Yes.
We call it the mind, but let's call it the brain for a second. But it's pretty self-evident that there's not two realities like Descartes posited. There's only one reality. So the thing that I'm kind of excited about in terms of understanding how we can have this dualistic view that's we've inherited from Descartes, let's say. And even, you know, Plato was dualistic in the ideals versus realism there. And that was his sort of version of Cartesianism, you could say. But there really is only one reality. So how do we resolve this paradox that there's the reality out external to us and there's a reality inside our head represented? And it kind of comes down to the ability for, well, humans to represent their reality with, in our case, you know, language, but actually it's broader than language. It's we communicate what we're experiencing in our world, our individual worlds, through a language which we've learned. And so in effect, we don't have an individual mind. It's the mind is really sort of transpersonal, because it's what we've adopted and what has been conditioned for us to see our reality in a certain way as we've grown up in a certain culture, a certain community that speaks a certain language. And so the mind really isn't a personal property of our brain. Our brain, you know, in the neurological states can sort of, there's a second order effect of neurological activity in our brains that allow us to speak in this higher order of language. And so that's kind of what we're really dealing with is, and when we're trying to say, how can there be two realities, one outside of our body and one inside of our body, we're really talking about how close or not our representations or our thoughts are of the external world. And it's between our thought and how we represent or speak that thought that expresses the outside world. So that epistemological paradox of thinking that there's two realities, when we know, everybody generally knows there's one reality. There's not two. There's not a non-material substance like Descartes said. There's only the material world, and we can. But it's about our interpretive capabilities, which we use language and you know, deductive, or not deductive necessarily, but logical thinking, that and you know, interpretation that allows us to see, allows us to represent the world we're experiencing. So, and the other point of that is that when we say, you know, consciousness, what is consciousness? We have to remember there's a range of consciousness. There's a consciousness of just complete sort of passive awareness, you know, and no real thought. And here it might be tied into Shashir's point about Eastern philosophy. Is Eastern philosophies are very aware of, through meditation, for example, that the brain just has a lot of thoughts that are passing through it. It doesn't mean they're all true about something or another. So it's just a capacity that this physical thing, the brain, has to make these thoughts. And so we can distance ourselves. We can have this very passive, non-interpretive view of, you know, our existence, our being in the world. And then we can go from there to being somewhat dualistic in terms of, like, if we're trying to walk through a doorway and the door jams or something, we sort of have to start interpreting, well, what's the matter? Maybe I need some oil or something. And you start doing things with the reality, you know, the best you can. And so you're more in a different state of consciousness. Right. And that's where, you know, you're using your education and your ability to make hypotheses and all this kind of stuff to solve the problem. So the point of all that is that there's different ranges of consciousness, and it's not just, you know, is consciousness some magical occult, you know, phenomenon. It's just the fact that the way our brains work, and animals have consciousness too. So it's everything you've been saying applies to them as well. But the thing about humans is we have a much greater linguistic capacity to transmit knowledge from generation to generation And so we have a much greater, we are sort of, you know, it's in sort of incorrect to say, but in a simplistic way, we're more conscious in a way than animals are. We can do
Sure.
science, we can do all this.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Because I think you're anticipating a lot of what's coming up for,
Okay, yeah.
in the
So go.
other part of the presentation. So that'll be a great
Yeah.
signpost for stuff as I proceed. Is that cool?
That's cool. And I would just say that the philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, an American philosopher, really nails this whole aspect and is really overthrows the Cartesian duality. And he also says that we have to be materialists without flinching, you know, and so it's a kind of an interesting point.
I'm really excited about the language piece, and I didn't quite get to it to the extent that I did preparing for this, but we can circle back to that in the next round of discussion. Is it okay with John and Bill and Ronan if I move ahead and then swing back to you guys first in the second round of discussion? Okay,
yeah,
good.
that's
And, I think
that's perfectly fine with me. Howard, yeah, good.
Yeah, so maybe this gets to what Tori was saying. Part two, digging into consciousness, levels and types of consciousness, some big topics: qualia, subjectivity, intentionality, representation, inner and outer worlds, and a quick brain interlude too, which maybe we can bypass. Just in terms of stuff that you were saying, Tori, Ramachandran refers to consciousness through language as, quote unquote, a representation of a representation. So he says the first representation takes place on a more primary neural level, and the second representation of consciousness takes place through linguistic mechanisms. So what is consciousness? I guess there's a computer model there. The graphic on the lower right, I think, was 17th century, and there's a kind of, it says Dieu. There's a god at the beginning, and there's the non-Western philosophical traditions, which I haven't given any attention to you know, though I would like to. I just I'm hoping someone else will pick that up. So dimensions or aspects of consciousness, as Tori pointed out, there are levels and degrees of consciousness, from deliberate attention to subconscious awareness, pre-conscious, unconscious. I guess you don't have to be a Freudian to believe that stuff's going on subconsciously or unconsciously. You just have to see a hypnotist show where the guy says, when I say sunrise, you'll crow like a rooster, and the guy crows like a rooster, but has no memory of it. Different types of consciousness. We have type of sensory impression, emotional activation, working memory, metacognition. I guess the third big topic is aboutness. Can we be conscious without being conscious of something? So the theory of intentionality says that no, we can have all these subconscious and preconscious levels of recognition, let's call them, and neural activity. But when we're really in a state of conscious alertness, we are conscious of something. Consciousness has content. The fourth big topic is subjective qualitative experience, what consciousness feels like. And that, I guess, goes down to, or returns to maybe our subjective insistence on ourselves as conscious beings beyond sort of neuroanatomy. So obviously, level states of conscious awareness, from very active to very passive. There can be passive background or embedded consciousness, subconscious. I came across the term dynamic preconscious. And I think that means that stuff's percolating and brewing, but not quite there yet. It might need another stimulus, or the brain itself might need to dip into those resources. So there's a range of mental states or states of neuronal activity, and they're generally acknowledged to affect and inform consciousness and behavior. Again, from unconscious motivations for behavior. I have a quirk that my wife finds really annoying. I tend to take things in my fingers and ball up little pieces of paper and paper clips, and she'll find them on the coffee table. Why do you ball up this little piece of paper? And I hadn't even known that I'd done it, or bending paper clips. In terms of conscious awareness, some stuff we know is at the ready, as 5 + 5, it's right there, 10. If we have to do 17 × 6 + 10, I could probably, quote unquote, do it in my head, but it would take a little more work. And so I think concur completely with Tori. Lots of stuff is embedded or at secondary layers until something becomes problematic, and then we call fuller attention to it. I can't, count the number of times where I've been driving on automatic pilot, the same route over and over, and I pull up in my driveway, and I know I've been driving, but to actually recall every stop sign and every light and every turn, no, I've just been doing it. Yet, had there been a light or a honk of the horn or something, I would have been moved to a more active alertness, and I would have been shifting from embedded consciousness to a more explicit consciousness. This is an interesting test, and hold on, I'm just going to take off. There we go. Sorry. There's an experiment where scientists, they put brain probes in a rat while he was doing a maze, and then they recorded the neuronal activity, and you can actually see that, it looks like flashes of light, and they kept the brain probe on, and while the rat slept, they also monitored the neuronal activity, and they noticed that the patterns in the sleeping rat replicated the neural patterns and activity of the waking rat. So they inferred, maybe perhaps with some poetic license, that the rat was dreaming about running the maze. And so I guess that might be an example of there being an evolutionary advantage to embedding something in consciousness. The rat got food when it completed the maze, and while it slept, presumably, if we trust the methodology and epistemology, those neural patterns were replicated and reinforced in sleep. The rat's dreaming about running mazes. Now, as someone who's less of a sticky materialist, I've noticed from the article, Robert Stickgold said that while Wilson's research provides evidence of sleep's role in memory, there is no way to prove MIT researchers were seeing a rat's dream. That's because the link between the rat's brain pattern and actual dreaming can't be proved. It's too subjective. So I guess maybe Stickgold's slightly more of a property dualist. Attention can be, attention's a big topic, and it pertains to, as I suggested earlier, it might pertain to ethics, certainly education, how we can direct our consciousness, and how maybe that has something to do with that informs impulse control as well. And certainly says something about to the extent we're conscious beings. So Welsh notes, and other critics note, 4 aspects of attention. It can be voluntary, top down. I can deliberately focus my attention on threading a needle, or I have to go to the fabric store. Do I have enough money? Do I have enough time? This is all voluntary, top down deliberation. And that comes, I think, with what they call working memory or executive function. Top down. It can be involuntary and stimulus driven. I can hear a car backfire and instinctively turn my head to see what's happening, or suddenly recognize the smell of gas and then turn to see whether I've left the stove on and the stove burning. So voluntary and top down, involuntary, stimulus driven. It can be externally or internally directed. I can thread the needle. I'm giving my attention to something on the outside. I can explore possible subconscious motivations for my behavior. Did I really intend to insult that person, or why did I say that? What was I thinking when I did that? So these are all sort of metacognitive instances where consciousness is directed to consciousness. And as well, attention can be short-lived or sustained. I can walk by and and catch a whiff of the roses and say, oh, there's roses. Or I can stop and take half an hour and sit by the roses and smell them. Or I can brood for weeks and months on end. Something can preoccupy my mind over a perceived insult that I've received or given. So voluntary top-down, involuntary, external, short-lived, or sustained, and several of these can occur in combination. In terms of neural architecture, I just quickly focus on, and again, this is pretty instinctive stuff and maybe basic primary stuff. They've identified a couple of areas, again, through impairment studies. The primary motor cortex, how we move, and primary somasensory cortex, how we feel things. So keep an eye out for the red and the green as we move to the next slide. The other thing that's obvious is the pink area. All that's just devoted to intermodal associations, so communications among the various modes. And one thing I found through this project is that the neuroscience is moving from a more compartmentalized modal model of consciousness to something that's transmodal, supramodal, heteromodal. And a lot of this pink area is devoted to that. Two primary areas of language that they've noted, Wernicke's area and Broca's area. And again, through impairment studies, they've been able to identify some of the functions associated with those areas. Here's an interesting piece of neural mapping, the Penfield homunculus. And so researchers have identified the surface area of the cortex in those two slivers that we saw earlier, the red and blue sliver, to motor sensory movement and tactility, how stuff feels on the skin. And they've noticed the largest pieces of real estate for both motor cortex and somatosensory cortex are the face, the tongue, and the hands. And we can think of the evolutionary biological advantage in having a lot of territory devoted to those apparatus. Language, Tori mentioned language, the speech, the tongue, the larynx, the lips, all of that. We have very, very fine motor control in our tongue and our mouths and our throats and our hands compared to, let's say, our knee or our shoulder or our shin bone. So, you know, some of this stuff has been mapped fairly successfully, and I think there's a decent consensus around that. Some of you might notice the proximity of the genitals to the toes in this map, and that might explain some predilections. Some of the stuff, Ramachandran did some work on phantom limbs, and he discovered that people who had their limbs amputated were able to felt pain, but also felt sensory awareness when their cheeks were touched. So he postulated a correlation between, you know, the cheek and the missing arm in this case. And he says, when an arm is amputated, no signals are received from the part of the brain's cortex corresponding to the hand, because the hand's not there. But the cortex becomes hungry for sensory input, and the sensory input from facial skin, from the face, now invades into the hand area, into the vacant territory corresponding to the missing hand. So signals from the face are then misinterpreted by the high centers of the brain as arriving from the missing hand. He's also done a lot of work with phantom pain, applying some of this principle, and been quite successful. Features of consciousness. 3 overriding and interrelated features have been noted. Qualia, qualitative consciousness, intentionality, aboutness, and that has to do with representation, and subjective perspectivity, the idea that it's coming from a subjective self. So conscious experience, most theorists have either noted or had to deal with, presumably has a qualitative feel to it. It's about some, experience is about something, it has a content. It has content, there's intentionality, and it happens inside the head of a subject. And just a reminder, by intentionality, that doesn't mean like a desire or a plan to do something. Intentionality can best be translated or understood as aboutness. When we think about something, keeping in mind there are those various levels of conscious awareness and conscious attention. A couple of quotations. Every conscious state has a qualitative feel to it, says John Searle. Getting back to our friend Ramachandran, the Qualia question is this: how does the influx of ions in little bits of jelly, the neurons, give way to the redness of red, or the flavor of paneer tikka masala, or wine? And Welshin asks, at what point do wavelength retinal activity and intracerebral neural firings become the conscious experience of magenta? And so again, there's a tension between the reductionists and the property dualists who say there's something extra. There were 3 famous thought experiments. Thomas Nagel asked what it's like to be a bat in 1974. Mary's Room, proposed by Frank Jackson in 1982, and David Chalmers talks about philosophical zombies. I'll only deal with the first one in the interest of time. But a piece from Nagel's article, a piece of language, and Tori mentioned language, ends up repeating everywhere in the philosophy of mind when it comes to qualia. And the lexical piece is something that it is like. So Thomas Nagel notes, bats are different from us. They're nocturnal. They have different sensory apparatus. They navigate through echolocution. And so their inner lives, he says, are obviously different from ours. We can't imagine what a bat experiences. And yet, Nagel says, there must be something that it is like to be a bat. An organism has a conscious mental state, if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. And that's the phrase that comes up all over the place, something that it is like, or something that it is likeness. So throughout my sort of exploration of the literature of philosophy of mind, when it came to qualia and subjective conscious experience, that phrase was all over the place. In terms of reduction, and the other example has to do with pain and neural firings. So does pain equal AC fibers firing and nothing more? So neurologists have identified some of the neurological pathways and architectures that result in us feeling pain. And here there's a noxious, what they call a noxious, a noxious stimulus. The nail hits the hand, it goes through primary afferent fibers A and C, through the spinal cord, makes a fairly sophisticated circuit through the brain. The prefrontal cortex and the ACC has to do with action. But what am I going to do with this now? But the question is, can even an extensive understanding of the neural pathways and the neural architecture and the neural correlates of consciousness, can that completely account for what pain feels like? Do the NCCs and the pathways capture what it actually feels like subjectively, as qualitative character, as experience, the qualia of pain? Again, qualia emerges as a challenge to reductive physicalism. Qualia arguments would prove that consciousness cannot be reduced merely to atoms in collision. The reductive physicalist account of consciousness, no matter how explicitly they trace a conscious state to a brain state or a neurophysiological state, it leaves out something essential, the argument goes, and that something is qualitative subjective experience. Related terms, first-person ontology and third-person ontology. First person, and this also comes up in the literature, first person refers to the subjective self, the qualitative inner experience, the mind. Presumably there's something ineffable about it. And third-person ontology has to do with objectivity, quantification, measurement, matter, science. So I guess in terms of ineffability, how this poses the problem, how do you describe the color red to a colorblind person? And the idea is that the experience of red is ineffable. It's just subjective. It has a subjective quality, but you can't really describe it. On the other hand, from a scientific perspective, red is assumed to be the color along the wavelength end of the visible spectrum next to orange and opposite violet. Its dominant wavelength is approximately 625 to 740 nanometers, according to optic theorists. Red is evoked by the light that stimulates neither the S or M, short or medium wavelength cone cells of the retina, but combining with the fading stimulation of L, long wave cone cells. And I don't have any idea what that means, but I think it's an example of first person and third person ontologies. A third person seeks to go outside the experience and quantify. It has to do with quantifiability and measurement. Oops, I'm going to go back. Are you feeling hunger? Feeling hungry, first or third person ontology. Covariance. For each and every conscious event, there is a corresponding brain event. These guys, I love this stuff. These guys did a study on the neural correlates of appetite and hunger-related evaluative judgments. And they found out when you're hungry and you're presented with food, various things are happening in the brain. When I think of free will, I come back to myself or trying to order food at a restaurant, and everybody else has ordered, and the server standing in front of me and saying, "What will you have?" And I've been debating between the chicken and the fish, and my brain's going ding, 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 chicken or fish, what do I want? And there's all sorts of other variables. What did I have yesterday? Do I need more? Should I have not have chicken 2 days in a row? And there's also the price on the menu. Do I want to pay, $35 for a piece of fish? And there's a social dimension as well. If I order the burger and fries again, well, the people, my dining companions, think that I'm a bore. So the server's standing there saying, "What will you have, sir?" And I'm completely muddled. The neurons are firing and inhibiting in equal proportion for the chicken and the fish. And I'd say, "What the heck, chicken," or "What the heck, fish?" But it doesn't feel like it's much of a decision. Intentionality. Conscious thought, especially active directive thought, is about something. It has content. It could be it could take its cues from the body. I'm hungry and I want some fish. Or it could be an alert cue about the dog, or an affection cue about the dog. That's a cute dog. Or it could just be a recognition that I've cut my finger. Or it could be a recognition of emotional states. I'm happy and excited today. Why? I don't know. I just feel good. Something going on with me, and maybe I'd have to dig into other conscious states to find out what's making me happy and excited today. Maybe there's something there. Emotions are intentional too. They're about something, I would argue, or some would argue. We can also have thoughts about just sort of situations in the world, fairly abstract. Today is Tuesday. Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada. Sort of state of affairs types of objects of consciousness. I'm interesting to see where this goes in the rest of the discussion too. I mean, I'm still committed to a sort of, or the president, as I've seen it, a lot of the literature is committed to maybe a tripartite division of experience between external world, internal neural states, and this third thing, how we make meaning or how stuff's represented to us. So what's the relationship between the objects of the external world and our consciousness of them? Intentionality, aboutness, and the contents of our thoughts arguably occur as representation, not as direct experience. And some of that representation can be sensory. It could be interoceptive, if I'm hungry or if I'm suddenly aware that I've hurt my ankle. It could be proprioceptive, as I'm moving through space, trying to pick a pencil off the desk or trying to shoot a basket. What's the relationship between the internal and the external world? Arguably representational. And as I said, Ramachandran says a representation of a representation when we're moving stuff, especially stuff that's not directly stimulating our sensory apparatus. If we're dealing with stuff from memory through language, a representation of a representation. So very quickly, three approaches to the inside-outside question and what's most real: internalism, externalism. Direct or naive realism, the idea that what we experience through the senses is exactly what's out there. There's indirect realism or representationalism. We get some version of what's out there, but we don't see things in themselves, but representations or neural reconstructions of them, delivered by a sensory apparatus and then processed by the brain. And by the brain, included in the brain is personal history, culture, consciousness, language. What a tree means for us in our culture might be different from what a tree means for someone in a different culture who views consciousness as moving through all living things, not just things with neural structures. And then there's idealism, the idea that there's no reality out there. There are no mind-independent objects. The only reality is in the mind. We come back to, I guess I'll mention Kant, and I may get to John Locke. So for Kant, he distinguishes between the noumenon, the thing in itself, ultimately unknowable with absolute certainty, and phenomenon, the thing as experienced through sensory apparatus and through consciousness, including culture, language, and for Kant, a couple of pure given a priori categories by which the brain or the mind organizes external experience, space, quantity, relation, etc., modality. What's the relation? What's going on between internal and external worlds? Representationalism, I guess what's inside and what's outside. some of the Gestalt switching stuff is interesting. There, in terms of the external world, it's the same ink on paper or the same pixels on a screen. Those are constant, but the experience can differ. I can look at this as now as a rabbit, now as a duck. Presumably, I can't do both of those mental operations at the same time. I can only switch. Searle says if we could find the point in the brain where the experience switches from duck to rabbit and vice versa, it looks like we would have the NCCs for that experience. I find the Necker cube kind of an interesting iteration of that, because it takes a little more work for me to see it in multiple ways. So I can see it with the closest surface of the cube at the bottom left, or I can see it at the top right. And I can switch back and forth. But unlike the duck and rabbit, which I can do pretty easily, this takes a little more deliberate conscious effort. And so I wonder what's going on neurologically as I try and gear my perceptive apparatus to see the frontal face here and the frontal face there. And sometimes I can't, it takes me a while for the neurology to kick in. Representation, how does the brain do it? Churchland says the brain has to, in some sense, reconstruct the world from the effects on nerves, and the world isn't surely given to us. It is a product of our brains. Very, very quickly, and I don't want to get too far into this, but just a quick overview of visual apparatus. We got two retinal cells, short-term and long-term. Then they move through this. They move through the LGN, the sorting center, lateral geniculate nucleus, and it's the kind of processing center before it goes to the visual cortex 1, and then it goes to visual cortex 2, 3, 4, and then ultimately to these cortexes. The shorter term one is dealing with processing and integrating sensory input, visuospatial navigation, and some language apparently. And this one, kind of more substantive maybe in terms of concepts, face recognition, object recognition, understanding meaning, language, memory acquisition, perception, processing, and auditory information. And I think I'll do one more screen, and then we'll turn it over to discussion and questions again. Again, you figure vision's fairly straightforward, or it seems fairly straightforward in terms of sensory apparatus, but it's hugely complicated, and it's multimodal, bidirectional, and instantaneous. So vision is an active process. It's not just that we see stuff and we register it. It goes here to the LGN, then it goes to Vision Center 1, and then all the red arrows are feedback loops. It goes through areas of consciousness as well. And all this happens apparently in 40 milliseconds. We see an image and we respond to it neurologically on so many different levels. Again, as John pointed out, I think if it's standard and non-problematic, there's less work for the brain to do. And this isn't photoshopped, it's just depth of field and perception. So seeing this image, it might take us a second to say, well, okay, the cat, I know cognitively the cow isn't standing on that fence post. So the brain goes ding, 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 ding. Okay, what's going on here? Oh yeah, of course. It's it's a tropodoid with based on perspective. So obviously, vision is not merely receptive; it's constructed through recurrent processing, and the feedback mechanisms include higher order stuff like attention, object expectation, what do I expect to see, scene segmentation, breaking it up, working memory, and encoding the recall of learned information. And so that's that's just the visual aspect. We're not even talking about working memory, thinking about thinking, representations of the self. Maybe a quick example. I see a Granny Smith apple, and what I make of it might depend on what's going on in my neural platform. When I was growing up, Granny Smith apples were a class marker in some ways. The rich kids brought Granny Smith apples to lunch, and the poorer kids brought Macintoshes. And so that kind of stuck with me. So when I see a Macintosh, I might remember my own biological experience of class consciousness as a kid. If I've recently been thinking about my grandmother, when I see Granny Smith apples, I might see the apple and think of my grandmother. If I saw Bugs Bunny recently, I might think of Tweety. if I'd recently seen the Grammys with lots of jokes about Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, when I see the Granny Smith apple, if I would be reading about the controversy, my mind might drift to the Grammys and Will Smith. Obviously, there's recurrent. It's not just a question of seeing the apple. The apple gets filtered through neurological platforms and architectures, and meaning is made on that level. Intentional states do not generally come in isolated units. Experience and phenomena occur within a network of father beliefs and intentional states, an elaborate interactive network. Okay, so I think if it's okay with everybody, I'll stop there, and maybe some of the the other stuff that I was playing around with will come through in the comments, questions, and answers.
I just wanted actually to go back to what Bill was talking about in the first set of questions, which is the topic of emergentism. And even more so, having seen the second part of your program, I think this is the key. And in a sense, it sort of ties the two parts of the talk together. Now, what I want to say is this, is that John Searle's position, which is called biological naturalism, is in fact a version of emergentism, or at least so I have argued. What I mean by this is that consciousness per se, with all of its qualitative aspects that you rightly drew attention to, is an emergent property of the biology. That's all it is, an emergent property of all the, as Bill was arguing. And if you think about it, of the books that you say, Searle's book was the most recent of them, I think 2003. That's not a key book. That was just a kind of a textbook on mind, but his work is early, 21st century.
Yep.
And if you think about it, it makes much of the previous literature redundant. It makes much of the neuroscience redundant, because all that the neuroscience is doing is exploiting the biology. But as you say, it doesn't actually get to the point of it doesn't actually deal with the emergent properties, and it makes a lot of the AI stuff redundant as well, because obviously AI, the one thing that's missing from AI is precisely biology. So Bill might want to sort of take up on that point because he's got a question there. Thanks, Howard. It's a great presentation, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I have something to say about biology, but I'll say it later. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Just sure.
No. Go ahead. Oh, Bill. I don't see. I see Manny's hand up. Bill and Ronan had their hands up from last time, but I don't know. You might, if you do, put your hands down and put them up again, and that might move you to the front of the queue. Okay, I'll go with Manny. Oh, there's Ronan. Yeah, Ronan. Sorry, Manny. Can you hold? Yeah.
Yeah.
Ronan.
Yeah, okay, here we go. Here we go. So let me just say that was really interesting, Howard. But I've thought about these ideas for a long time, and I have to say, despite what John Smithen said there, that I think of myself really as a hardcore mind-body dualist. And the reason for that, I mean, I think I'm more or less Cartesian in a way. I know that's anachronistic, and a lot of people think it's ridiculous, the mind-body dualism idea. But I think that it's one of the most natural explanations for mind. Mind, it seems to me, is so different that it's very hard to simply say that mind is an emergent or an epiphenomenon that is reducible to matter. And you touched on this, Howard. The most significant problem is subjectivity. We have subjective selves. We feel pain. So if you look at somebody's brain while they're experiencing the subjectivity of pain, you can't see the pain that they're experiencing. If you look at somebody's brain when they're seeing magenta, like you said, you can't see magenta in their brain. I mean, it's a very subjective experience. But anyway, these are all very interesting questions. But one of the things that you didn't talk about, which I find very interesting, is the whole notion of consciousness and artificial intelligence. artificial intelligence is something that's emerging now. People are talking about it. I don't know if people are familiar with Chat GPT. This is all the rage now. And if you haven't tried Chat GPT, it's a very interesting, maybe it's an algorithm. I don't know. It is an algorithm. But the question becomes, is it possible that sometime in the future, some kind of an artificial intelligence like Chat GPT will actually develop consciousness? I mean, this is something that, philosophers talk about. I'm not sure that consciousness is dependent on biology. It's not far-fetched to imagine that consciousness can emerge through computer technology or through some other kind of platform other than biology. But I'm just wondering, Howard, if you came across any discussions on consciousness and artificial intelligence in your readings.
Yeah, for sure. Lots of stuff. And there's a whole body to varying degrees called sort of a computational theory, and certainly the development of computer technology has informed the debate, the question of consciousness. I mean, John Searle deals with that, or partially deals with that, with an experiment called the Chinese room experiment. And essentially, you can imagine someone in a room, they're getting, you're familiar with the thought experiment. They're getting all the cues and passing back linguistic cues based on prompts, but he has no idea what either the incoming cards or the outgoing cards say. In terms of ultimate possibility, sure, my personal feeling is sure, why not? I think we're a long, I think we're a long way from that. I don't think we imagine for a minute that Siri or Alexa is conscious. Essentially, they're Turing machine parlor tricks that imitate human consciousness. And I might swing back to, well, once I'm here, I guess. I read an article that says, part of what makes human central to human consciousness, and maybe to consciousness overall, is the body, and what that means in terms of death awareness, the urgency, hunger, sexual appetite, the fact that we eat and defecate. All that stuff is central to the evolution of our consciousness. I guess we're talking 86 billion neurons with over 100 trillion connections. I mean, it's conceivable that can be replicated in silicone rather than meat. But I see that as a long way off, and maybe it's my sentimentality. I think consciousness, as I understand it, and as I think some of the emerges in some of the literature, is tied to biology, and even, as I say, some of those basic biological functions, death awareness, processing language. Anyway, so many, and then Bill, thanks Ronan. Yeah, it's a huge topic, and AI has obviously really informed the debate. Many, and then Bill.
Yeah. So as
Many?
you were, yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about AI, and I was thinking about a lot of thought experiments, and I was thinking of the consequences of pure materialism as reflected in science fiction. A lot of science fiction. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for that, there would be very little science fiction around. Before I start, the one thing about Chat GPT is it's a machine. There is a paper on the internet that you need to know the industry to understand it, and I don't claim to. But from 2017 by Google researchers, you can read it. You can see what they've done to form a very sophisticated language model, which mimics human perhaps, but is not human by any stretch of the imagination. So as far as thought experiments, there are umpteen thought experiments that have to do with the mind. The first one is cloning, right? If it's just a materialism, right? All of a sudden there's a copy of me, right? And this is a very disturbing thought, right? What would that copy be like? It's exactly like me, exactly like my brain, but it's not me at all, right? It doesn't really matter. It's not me, right? I have my own identity, right? And then the next topic is, well, then what about what about the whole idea of the technology that transplants brains, right? Now, I know this is sci-fi. It's very clear, but it's a thought experiment, right? So what if my brain was transplanted into a machine? What would I be like? And I think that sheds a different perspective, a different light on the mind problem and on materialism, right? There are more, right? But the other thing I thought about, Howard, as you were talking as well, is how much we are actually alike in many respects, right? Because we do have similar hardware. Maybe some of us can make more connections and be more eloquent than others, right? But we're actually quite alike. We have this, our thoughts. I bet that my thoughts and my thought patterns, are very similar to many other people's, and because I share the same hardware, right? And whatever my brain comes up with, the emergent property of whatever it is, right? It's similar to many others. And none of us can, for example, see in infrared, right? I'm not aware of any humans that can hear very well above 20 kilohertz, right? We're limited by our biology, right? So it's a kind of interesting perspective. As you were saying, the mind, those are the thoughts that went through my mind.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's so many ways to go with this, so many approaches.
And there are so many approaches. Of sci-fi is sci-fi, but I think those are thought experiments that really kind of makes one think. And fortunately, there are many entertaining examples around, like the movie Ex Machina, if you've seen it, right? Very interesting. There's a number of examples, right? A number of examples, right? I think it would be. I think thinking that I think we should be humbled, because this is our biology, and our biology is giving rise to the language and sentences I'm saying, right, and to my thought processes, and I think there's just a lot more to our biology that we don't understand. There's a lot going on, a lot of connections, right? And and I think that normally what we don't understand becomes mystical, and but I think it's just we don't understand it yet. Once we understand a lot more of it, it'll make a lot more sense.
I might be breaking up, so if I do, please just continue the conversation without me, and I'll come back in when I do. Bill and then Henry.
So the last couple of conversations have been really interesting. Subjectivity is a tricky thing because it's different for everybody. You can think in terms of some people react differently to other things. Some people get scared, where other people are just fine. Psychopaths never feel guilt. So where you and I might. Let's say normal person, I'm using normal in an abstract sense there, but would feel guilty at seeing somebody, running somebody over. A psychopath wouldn't. So subjectivity is subjective, completely subjective. And then if we take that to robots or AI, let's talk about something as simple as hunger. So we all feel hunger. We all feel hunger subjectively, in that we feel pain, we feel discomfort, we feel I don't want to be like this for much longer perspective. What would the equivalent be in an artificial intelligence or a robot? So the robot can very easily measure its battery level. Right now, the robots don't care. They just let themselves dwindle down and turn off. What if, but you can imagine a robot who would then start behaving in a way that we interpreted as hunger. So for instance, they might say, when their battery level reaches 80%, they start to get a little, whatever worried would be to a robot, and start to look for a power outlet, a charging station or something. And then if it made it down to 60%, it would start to get a little more frantic about looking for that. And when it got down to 20%, it would start to behave as if it was scared of running out of power. It would start to be angry. It would start to be, if it could sweat, it would sweat. If it could, cry, it would cry, kind of thing. And at what level does that simple meter that's registering how much energy it has left become a subjective thing for it, the way we would subjectively feel hunger? Because at its core, hunger is just our body's way of measuring that need for more energy, right? The same way a robot could do. But it's interesting to to see at what level, could we program a robot, or could a robot exist in being afraid to die, like to be afraid to be turned off and act, the way we would if we were going to be turned off. And at what point do we have to say, yeah, that robot is actually legitimately afraid, or it's legitimately hungry. Should we care? And there are plenty of people, who can put themselves in a mindset of saying, I'm not hungry. I'm not going to care that I'm hungry, right? And so subjectivity is a really tricky thing, and it's not at all clear what subjectivity is to me, because it's so varied, and it's something that we all know we have, but we cannot describe at all.
I was just going to say, in terms of, like you mentioned, programming, if we program the robot to seek a recharge at a certain level, then it's not emergent consciousness, right? So, the challenge would be whether none of that was programmed, but somehow the emergent leap was made where the robot cares about its existence, right? Because if it's just pre-programmed, then it's just, it's just following ones and zeros, right?
Yeah, but if we had a robot that behaved the way we do when we're hungry, like let's say you move to press the button on a robot to turn it off, and the robot slapped your hand away, right? And then, when you brought in 3 other people to help you turn that robot off, it started to cry and plead and say, please don't turn me off, please don't turn me off, and started to try to run away from you. At some point, we as humans would start to feel empathy for it and start to feel, geez, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, because it seems to be behaving in a way that makes it appear that it's feeling, even though you and I know very well that it's just behaving, as we've programmed it to behave, and it's just reading a battery meter, or it's recognizing that the power switch will turn it off in a very logical way. It's still, it is almost behaving subjectively at that point, because it's behaving the way we expect somebody who has subjectivity and feels pain and things like that would behave.
Can I just say something in relation to that?
Can I call on Henry first, and then I'll get to you, Ronan? I just want to try to preserve your
And by
order.
the way, I think Dave had something to say too. He put up his hand, right, Dave? I don't know if you.
I don't see it.
Yeah, no, he didn't put up his hand. He put up his real hand.
His actual hand.
His
Okay.
real hand, yeah.
So are we good with Henry, Dave, and then you, Ronan?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Yep.
I'll be good. I'll do my best. In terms of robots behaves the way it is programmed. So basically, it depends on the algorithms put in this program. So this is fairly clear. But the question relates to clones. Clones are created based on a genetic makeup. So basically, you get the cell, and you have the complete DNA structure, so you can use, and based on that, you create a clone. This is the simplified idea, but this is the foundation. Now, the question is, how about mind? How about consciousness? Is mind and consciousness are contained in the DNA? That's the question. I believe it's a fundamental question, and I don't expect an answer. It's just a food for thought. But I think it's a critical one.
Well, I mean, I think there's a theory of panpsychism that the rudiments of consciousness are in in every molecular interaction. And I think David Chalmers and some others take sort of that panpsychic approach that there's consciousness in all matter. Dave, thanks, Henry. Dave, you're on mute. Can you hear?
No.
No, Dave, we can't hear you, I'm afraid.
You're breaking up.
Breaking up.
Yeah, you can put maybe.
Don't go.
Time for any microphone. Dave.
Or connection. Dave, do you want to put the stuff in the chat? Because we're having a hard time hearing. Maybe different me.
Turn your video off, Dave.
Yeah.
Turn the video off. All right. How's that?
That's better.
It's better, but
All right. Better. Anyway, look it up yourself.
Sorry, Dave, we still can't hear
Dave,
you.
well, I think we have to move on, Dave. It's not working. Can you mute yourself again, please? Yeah,
Maybe put it in
sorry
the
about that. Put, as someone said, put something in the chat, right?
Ronan, is that where we are?
Yeah, I was just gonna. I was actually going to respond to Bill. Bill's point about robots and artificial intelligence. You know, it brings up ethical questions. You know, because if something seems conscious, and has subjective, sort of seems to have a subjective awareness, does it? I mean, how do we know that it doesn't? You know, where do we draw the line? So if we create an artificial intelligence that seems conscious, seems aware, how do we know that it's not aware? You know, and if we think about ourselves, if we look at each other, we're making assumptions about the other's consciousness. When I look at you people, I'm assuming you're conscious because you're biological beings, you're like me, so I'm making an assumption. But I don't know with absolute certainty that you're conscious because I can't actually embody you. I can't step inside your head and see what you're seeing through your eyes or through your homunculi or your subjective selves. So a lot of what we assume about the other is based on pure subjectivity coming from us. And therefore, you know, if a thing seems conscious, like a robot or an artificial intelligence, where do we say, okay, well, then we have to give it the rights that human beings have, or we need to treat it with some ethical sort of consideration? I don't think these are far-fetched questions.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of David Chalmers' philosophical zombie argument: we can't penetrate each other's consciousness. Or also the idea of inverted qualia. If you from birth have seen green, what everybody else sees blue, and still calls it blue, then no one would know, right? Bill and Henry, is your hand up?
Howard, if I just break in, sorry, Henry. Sure. You've got a couple more questions, so I think we'll kind of have to wrap it up after those two, and then, you know, after Henry and Bill, turn it back to Alla, you know, for the final say. Thanks.
Is it me? Yeah, and then I guess the question, you know, those discussions that we've been having around subjectivity, flipping it the other way and saying, okay, well, we've talked about what does it mean for an AI to be subjective, but what does it mean for us to be subjective? Like, so, you know, when I feel hunger, or when I, you know, in your images, if I cut my finger and I feel pain, is that just a meter in my brain, like equivalent to the robot's meter, that is saying, you know, don't cut your finger, because this is what happens when you cut your finger? And is hunger just a way of my body, my biological body, saying you got to eat, you know? And the only way we can work is through subjective things, because we're not built to actually have those objective meters and pay attention to them. So if we didn't feel uncomfortable, we would just forget to eat, right? So because we're not the kind of beings that would pay attention to a meter the way we pay attention to, say, a gas meter. You know, if it was inside our head, we wouldn't necessarily pay attention to it, or we'd forget to eat. So we have to have these painful experiences in order to behave in a rational way. But are those painful experiences just basically the way our biology manifests those meters? You know, of saying, you know, you don't have enough fuel, you better get some. You shouldn't climb out on that ladder because you might fall, and you know, heights are bad, so stay away from them. You know, is what we interpret as pain and love and all those kind of, you know, subjective emotions, or even red, you know, like is it just our brain saying that this is what I'm going to call red, and you know, that wavelength is and it's just because we do not have computers for minds. We need something there that becomes subjective instead of just a piece of data.
Thanks. Henry?
Just to return to the idea of consciousness. Well, the whole Hinduism is based on this, that the consciousness is part of any creature, and even material or biological or non-biological. But again, if we're talking about the clones created based on our DNA, and our DNA contains what we call consciousness, which is quite abstract. If you're talking about universal consciousness or personal consciousness, or mind, if you will, so it means this clone is no different. This clone has my mind, my consciousness, and it's damn scary.
Well, if I can just we're using the term clone here. Is that what we mean, like a biological clone? Because we already have clones. We already have information about clones that are, say, identical twins. So they have identical DNA, but they're definitely distinct consciousnesses, and they grow in different ways. So, I mean, when we talk about cloning, as in, you know, I create a clone of myself biologically, that's basically just an identical twin, one generation removed, right? So they would have completely their own consciousness. An interesting spin on this is, say, Star Trek's transporter, right? Like, if I dematerialize in Toronto and I rematerialize in New York, am I the same being? You know, yes, I have all my memories and things like that. And what happens if you can create a copy? Like, okay, I now create a copy of me here and me in Montreal at the same time. So now there's two of me have been transported, and I now have two copies. So each of us would claim to be the original, right? And there'd be, you know, that's an interesting, crazy but interesting question about, you know, which one of us is the original, or maybe neither of us is the original. Maybe we died and got recreated. You know, so.
When I was mentioning clones, that is what I meant, a copy of myself at this time, not a twin. That is the disturbing thought. So
Yeah, I mean, the whole aspect that I didn't really have a chance to get into is self and selfhood, and some of the theories surrounding that in terms of either neurological platform or you know, most deeply embedded language structures. Lots and lots of different theories of self that are out there, and maybe someone else at another time will you know, we'll pick up that topic and run with it a little bit. So thanks very much, everyone. John, I think is that it for this session, I believe?
Yeah, that's kind of it. I will just turn it over to Alla to wrap up the proceedings.
Okay. Thank you, John. Thanks to Howard. It was very deep and exciting presentation. I'm pretty sure everyone enjoyed it. And thank you, everyone, for participating and for coming. And see you next month. Our speaker going to be Professor Graham Hobbs, and topic going to be GEM and Scobbs moral philosophy. So everyone is welcome.